I had never anticipated that inviting my nephew to stay overnight would result in one of the most extraordinary evenings of my life. The events of that night continue to leave me in a state of bewilderment, and I feel compelled to share this experience, as I am uncertain how to interpret it. This all transpired less than a week ago, as my nephew Luke was scheduled to arrive within the hour. I found myself smoothing the bedspread once more. Despite its neatness, it was a nervous habit I struggled to overcome, one that seemed to resurface whenever I was preparing to host a guest. Although Luke was family, it had been some time since we had spent meaningful time together. He had always been polite and somewhat reserved, yet charming in his own quiet manner. Now, at 19, he had transformed into a young man, no longer the awkward teenager who had spent weekends with us years prior. It had been nearly 2 years since I last saw him, and I realized I was uncertain about what to expect. The knock on the door jolted me from my reverie. Upon opening it, I found Luke standing there with a suitcase in hand, a sheepish grin spreading across his face. "Hey, Uncle Joe," he greeted, his voice deeper than I remembered. "Thanks for having me." "Of course, sweetie," I replied, stepping aside to welcome him in. "Come on in, you must be tired from your journey." He appeared taller than I recalled, with broader shoulders and a more defined face. His dark hair fell loosely over his forehead, which he brushed aside with a casual gesture. There was a newfound confidence in his movements, relaxed yet self-assured, that took me by surprise. An inexplicable pang stirred in my chest, though I could not identify its origin. Luke set his bags down in the entryway and surveyed his surroundings, his eyes absorbing the familiar setting. "It's been a while," he remarked with a light laugh. "I forgot how cozy this place is." "Coziness?" I teased, raising an eyebrow. "You mean small." "No," he quickly replied, shaking his head. "I mean it feels like home." His words resonated with me in a way I had not anticipated. "Well, I'm glad you feel that way," I said, my tone softening. "Come on, I'll show you to your room." As I guided him down the hallway, I couldn't help but notice the extent of his transformation. He exhibited a newfound sense of maturity that was previously absent, and there was a comforting aura about him that seemed to envelop the space around us. It was not merely that he had matured, it was the way he regarded me, his hazel eyes meeting mine with a sincerity that felt, perhaps, intimate. Yet, I had always assumed he was attracted to women, though I would soon discover otherwise. "This is for you," I said, opening the door to the guest room. "I hope it meets your approval." Luke entered, placing his bags beside the bed. "It's wonderful," he replied, turning to me with a smile. "Thank you for preparing it." I lingered in the doorway, uncertain why I didn't simply allow him to settle in. "If you need anything, just let me know," I said, my voice now softer. "I will," he responded, his gaze lingering on mine for a moment too long. Eventually, I pulled myself away, retreating to the kitchen under the pretense of preparing dinner. However, as I chopped vegetables and stirred the pot on the stove, I could not dismiss the memory of his smile and the way his voice had softened when he uttered the word home. It was an unusual sensation, one that left my chest tight and my thoughts disordered. By the time we sat down for dinner that evening, I was already feeling something. The meal was simple: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of wine that I had opened more for my own enjoyment than for Luke's. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the warm glow of the overhead light casting gentle shadows on his face. "This is really delicious," Luke remarked as he cut into his chicken. "I don't eat like this at school." I laughed. "What, no home-cooked meals in the dorms?" "Not unless you count microwaved ramen," he replied with a grin. "I'm serious, though, you're an excellent cook." His compliment took me by surprise, and I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. "Thank you," I said, striving to maintain my composure. "It's nice to cook for someone who appreciates it." The conversation flowed effortlessly from that point, covering topics such as his classes, his part-time job, and the friends he had made at school. Luke had a way of speaking that rendered everything intriguing, his voice low and warm. A subtle touch of humor kept a smile on my face, and at one point, I noticed he had paused his meal, his fork suspended in midair as he observed me. "What?" I inquired, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Nothing," he replied quickly, shaking his head. "You just seem happy, it's nice." Unsure of how to react, I simply smiled and took a sip of wine, hoping he wouldn't notice the slight tremor in my hands. After dinner, Luke insisted on assisting me with the cleanup. We stood side by side at the sink, the sound of running water and the clinking of dishes filling the comfortable silence. "You don't have to do this," I remarked, glancing at him as he dried a plate. "You're a guest, and you've been taking care of me all night." "Let me return the favor," he replied lightly. There was something in the way he said it, the softening of his voice, that made my breath hitch. I turned my attention back to the sink, focusing on the soapy water and the sponge in my hand, yet I was acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his presence brushing against my skin like a gentle whisper. "Thanks for letting me stay," he said quietly after a moment. "I know I kind of invited myself." "Don't be silly," I responded, turning to face him. "You're always welcome here." Our eyes locked, and for a brief moment, the atmosphere between us seemed to shift. There was a weight in his gaze, something unspoken yet undeniably present. My pulse quickened, my heart pounding like a drum. "It means a lot," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. His words lingered in the air, their sincerity wrapping around me like a warm embrace. I wanted to say something, anything, to alleviate the tension building between us, but the words eluded me. Instead, I nodded, my throat too tight to articulate a response. As the moment passed, Luke returned to the dishes, his movements relaxed and unhurried, but the memory of his gaze remained, burning like a brand in my mind. However, the evening did not conclude after the dishes were cleared. Luke wandered into the living room, and I followed, feeling the magnetic pull of his presence. He sank onto the couch with a comfortable ease, his long leg extended before him as he patted the cushion beside him. "Come on, Uncle Joe," he said with a grin, "sit down. You've been on your feet all day." I hesitated for a brief moment before taking the seat next to him, sensing a subtle shift in the atmosphere as I did. This was not our first time sitting together on this couch, but tonight felt distinct. The house was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the ceiling fan, and the soft light from the floor lamp cast a warm glow over the room. "What do you want to watch?" I inquired, reaching for the remote, but Luke playfully snatched it from my hand. "Let me choose," he said, scrolling through the options. "I don't trust your taste," I laughed, leaning back against the cushions. "Excuse me, but I have excellent taste," he retorted. "You're the one who used to make me sit through all those dreadful action films." "They weren't dreadful," he countered, his tone lighthearted. "They were classics." "Classically bad," I shot back, eliciting a chuckle from him, the sound rich and low, sending a shiver down my spine. Eventually, he settled on a nature documentary featuring a soothing narrator and stunning wildlife footage. It was the kind of program that could easily induce relaxation, yet I found myself acutely aware of Luke's closeness, the warmth of his arm brushing against mine as we sat side by side. He glanced at me from the corner of his eye, a small smile dancing on his lips. "You okay?" "Yeah," I replied quickly, diverting my gaze from him. "Why wouldn't I be?" "No reason," he said, his smile broadening slightly. "You just seem quiet." I forced a laugh, hoping it sounded genuine. "Just tired, I guess." The truth was, my thoughts were in turmoil. I couldn't help but notice how his shoulders filled out his t-shirt, or how the light caught his jawline when he turned his head. It was maddening, this sudden awareness of him, and I scolded myself for allowing my mind to wander. He was my nephew, for heaven's sake. Yet, Luke appeared oblivious to my inner conflict as he settled back into the couch, his arm resting casually along the back. I found myself leaning slightly into the space he had created, drawn to his effortless confidence. "This is nice," he remarked after a moment, his voice gentle. "I don't experience much quiet like this at school, it's always loud and bustling." I nodded in understanding, glancing at him. "You probably don't have much time to yourself." "Not really," he confessed. "That's why I wanted to come here, I needed a break." "I'm glad you did," I replied sincerely. "It's been pleasant having you around." He turned to face me, his hazel eyes locking onto mine, and there was something in his gaze that took my breath away. "I've missed this," he said softly, "just being here with you." The words lingered in the air, and for a brief moment, silence enveloped us. I could feel the warmth of his gaze and the sincerity in his voice, which tightened my chest. I've missed it too, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. The documentary continued to play, but I hardly noticed the stunning landscapes and wild animals. My focus was entirely on Luke. I observed the subtle movements he made, his hand resting on his thigh, fingers drumming absent-mindedly against the fabric of his jeans. At some point, he shifted closer, his arm brushing against mine, sending a jolt of awareness through me. My heart raced so loudly that I was convinced he could hear it, yet he appeared unfazed. "You seem tense," he remarked suddenly, his voice low and filled with concern. "Is something bothering you?" "No," I replied quickly, though my voice betrayed me. "Why do you ask?" He tilted his head, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You just seem distracted, like you're carrying a heavy burden." I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" he inquired, his tone light yet probing. "Come on, Uncle Joe, you can talk to me." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump form in my throat. It wasn't that I had anything specific to reveal, but the way he looked at me with such openness and care made me feel unexpectedly vulnerable. "I'm fine, really," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He chose not to press further, but the atmosphere remained charged. He directed his gaze towards me, his look lingering, soft yet probing. I turned my attention back to the screen, hoping that the distraction would alleviate the tension, but I could sense his eyes on me, his presence undeniable as the evening progressed. The documentary concluded, and a comfortable silence enveloped the room. Luke shifted beside me, stretching his arms overhead with a groan. "All right," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. "I think I'm going to head to bed." I nodded, my chest tightening as he rose. "Good night," I replied, my voice softer than I had intended. "Good night, Uncle Joe," he responded, his smile warm and sincere. "Thanks for tonight, it was nice." As he vanished down the hallway, I remained seated for a considerable time, the warmth of his presence still palpable in the room. My thoughts were a chaotic blend of confusion, yearning, and an indescribable depth. I reassured myself that it was nothing, that I was merely overthinking, yet the ache in my chest suggested otherwise. Something had changed between us that evening, something I could not dismiss. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I understood that this was merely the beginning. However, nothing had transpired that night, not yet. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a gentle glow over the living room where I sat with my coffee. I had been awake for hours, unable to dispel the thoughts that had occupied my mind since the previous night, the way Luke had looked at me, the warmth in his voice, it all lingered like a melody on repeat. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. He entered the room, his hair slightly tousled from sleep, dressed in a casual t-shirt and joggers that fit his lean frame perfectly. He wore an easy smile that only enhanced his charm. "Morning," he said, his voice low and gravelly from sleep. "Good morning," I replied, hoping my voice conveyed steadiness. He settled onto the couch, his presence infusing the room with an effortless energy. "You're up early," he remarked. "I couldn't sleep," I admitted, taking a sip of my coffee. He tilted his head, his hazel eyes scrutinizing me. A thought crossed my mind, but I dismissed it with a shake of my head. There was simply too much to accomplish today. Luke reclined on the couch, stretching his arms along its back. "If there's anything I can assist with, just let me know," he offered. His proposal was straightforward, yet the sincerity in his voice caused a tightening sensation in my chest. "Thank you, Luke," I replied. "Of course," he responded, his smile softening. "That's what family is for." The day progressed leisurely, with Luke remaining nearby, his presence a constant source of comfort. We settled into a relaxed rhythm, tidying the house, preparing lunch together, and engaging in light conversation about various topics. It was the kind of day that felt eternal, as if time had slowed just for us. At one point, we found ourselves in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a salad. Luke stood beside me, our arms brushing against each other occasionally as he worked. Each contact sent a small thrill through me, making me acutely aware of his every movement. "You're quiet today," he remarked, glancing my way. "Just focused," I replied quickly, though the reality was far more complex. He smiled knowingly but chose not to delve deeper. Instead, he reached over and snatched a piece of cucumber from the cutting board. Hey! I protested, swatting at his hand, but he laughed, popping the cucumber into his mouth. Best chef's privilege, he teased, his grin playful. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound light and genuine. Moments like these felt so effortless, yet beneath the surface lay an unspoken tension, something deeper. Later, we returned to the living room, where Luke lounged on the couch with his legs stretched out, while I nestled in the armchair with a book. The soft murmur of music filled the silence between us. At one point, I glanced up to find him observing me, his gaze steady and contemplative. What? I asked, feeling self-conscious under his scrutiny. Nothing, he replied, his lips forming a small smile. You just seem different. Differently how? I inquired, my heart racing. He shrugged, his eyes never leaving mine. I don't know. Happier, maybe? More alive? His words took me by surprise. The guard's intense gaze left me momentarily speechless, causing my heart to race and an unfamiliar warmth to envelop me. Thank you, I suppose, I murmured, averting my eyes. However, Luke persisted, stating, I mean it, Uncle Joe, you deserve to feel that way all the time. His voice was imbued with sincerity and concern, stirring a deep ache in my chest. I longed to articulate how profoundly his words affected me, yet the lump in my throat rendered me mute. Instead, I offered Ed a slight smile, hoping it conveyed the emotions I could not express. As the afternoon progressed and the sun sank lower in the sky, the atmosphere between us became increasingly charged, as if the very air was thick with unspoken tension. Luke rose from the couch, stretching leisurely before casting a glance in my direction. I think I'll take a shower, he remarked casually. Okay, I replied, my voice softer than I had intended. As he walked down the hallway, I exhaled shakily, my emotions swirling in a tumultuous storm. There was something in the way he looked at me and spoke that left me feeling disoriented, as if the ground beneath me had shifted. I attempted to refocus by picking up my book, but the words blurred together, my mind refusing to cooperate. The sound of the shower running in the distance only heightened my restlessness, prompting me to pace the room, my thoughts racing. When Luke returned, his hair damp and his t-shirt slightly clinging to his chest, he regarded me with a softness that made my heart flutter. Feel better? I inquired, my tone light, though it belied the excitement in my chest. Yeah, he replied, running a hand through his hair. Thanks. He settled back onto the couch, his presence both grounding and exhilarating, intensifying the palpable tension between us. As evening descended, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Luke proposed watching a movie. I agreed, hoping that the distraction would alleviate the weight of the moment. The distance between us was palpable, yet as we sat closely on the couch, the gap felt insufficient. Each time his arm brushed against mine, my breath caught, and I could sense the warmth emanating from his skin. At one moment, he shifted nearer, his leg pressing against mine, and the contact sent a surge through me that was impossible to overlook. I stole a glance at him, my heart racing, but he remained focused on the screen, his expression inscrutable. This unspoken tension between us was exasperating, as we danced around something neither of us dared to articulate. Nevertheless, the attraction was unmistakable, a magnetic force that could not be disregarded. As the credits rolled, Luke turned to me, his hazel eyes locking onto mine. Thank you for today, he said softly, his voice imbued with a significance that tightened my chest. You don't need to thank me, I replied, my voice quivering slightly. I'm just glad you're here. His gaze lingered, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as if time had frozen, the only sound being the gentle hum of the music in the background. Then, he smiled, a small, sincere smile that warmed my heart in the most delightful way. Good night, Uncle Joe, he said, rising and disappearing down the hallway. Left alone in the stillness of the living room, my thoughts swirled chaotically. I realized this was merely the beginning, something had changed between us, an alteration that could not be reversed. While it filled me with trepidation, it also ignited a sense of anticipation I could not ignore. The hours of the night dragged on, slow and endless. After Luke had gone, I remained rooted on the couch, my thoughts ensnared in a tangle of confusion, desire, and fear. The once comforting silence of the house now felt suffocating as I replayed every moment of the day. Eventually, I stood, feeling the discomfort in my legs from sitting too long. The soft music had faded, leaving the room enveloped in silence. I made my way to the kitchen, hoping that a glass of water would soothe the fluttering in my chest, but just as I reached the sink, I paused. I heard the gentle creak of the floorboards behind me, prompting me to turn around. My breath caught in my throat as I saw Luke standing in the doorway. He was barefoot, dressed in a loose t-shirt and pajama pants, his hair still slightly damp from his shower. His expression was inscrutable, yet there was a quiet intensity in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. "Couldn't sleep?" I inquired, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head and stepped into the kitchen. "No, I guess not. What about you?" I glanced down at the glass in my hand. "Same. Too much on my mind, I suppose." He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. "Is there anything you want to discuss?" His question took me by surprise, and I hesitated, uncertain of how to respond. The weight of the day, along with the weight of his presence, hung heavily between us, unspoken yet undeniable. "I don't know," I admitted, setting the glass down. "Sometimes it's hard to articulate my thoughts." Luke nodded, his gaze steady and contemplative. "I understand." For a moment, silence enveloped us. It was not uncomfortable, but rather charged with the tension that had been building throughout the day. Finally, he pushed off the counter and took a deliberate step closer. "Uncle Joe," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made my heart race. "I want to say something, but I don't want to make things awkward." My heart pounded as I met his gaze, his hazel eyes searching mine. "You can express whatever is on your mind, Luke." He hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he were struggling to find the right words. "I've been feeling, since I arrived, things seem different." "You feel different, and I'm not sure what that means, but it's there." His words lingered in the air, causing my chest to tighten. The vulnerability in his voice resonated deeply within me. I was unsure how to respond or if I even should, but the connection between us was undeniable. "Luke," I began, my voice trembling. "This is complicated." "I know," he interjected quickly, stepping closer. "I know it is, but I can't ignore it any longer. I can't pretend I don't feel something." My breath caught as he spoke. He extended his hand, lightly brushing against mine. The contact was gentle, almost tentative, yet it sent a surge of electricity through me that was impossible to overlook. "Luke," I whispered again, my voice barely audible. "We can't." He interrupted, his tone both firm and gentle. "But tell me you don't feel it too." His words froze me in place, and for a brief moment, I found it hard to breathe. The undeniable truth was laid bare before me, and I could no longer refute it. "I do," I confessed, my voice quivering. "But that doesn't mean I'm asking for anything." He quickly responded, his hazel eyes earnest. "I just needed you to know." The vulnerability in his voice shattered something within me, and before I could think, I reached out and placed my hand on his arm. His skin was warm beneath my touch, and I sensed him tense before he relaxed under my fingers. "Luke," I said softly, my voice now steady. "This, whatever it is, cannot be rushed. We must proceed with caution." "I know," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I assured him, tightening my grip on his arm. "But we need to take our time and think this through." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Okay, slow. I can manage that." For a moment, we stood in silence, the weight between us no longer suffocating but filled with understanding, a quiet agreement that, despite the challenges ahead, we would face them together. Finally, I stepped back, releasing his arm. "We should get some rest," I said softly, my voice steady, though my heart raced. He nodded, a small smile gracing his lips. "Good night, Uncle Joe." "Good night, Luke," I replied, watching as he turned and walked down the hallway. There was something in his eyes, inviting, perhaps even more than that. As I stood in the stillness of the kitchen, my thoughts swirled. I sensed that something significant was approaching, but I tried to push it aside. However, when I lay in bed, I could no longer contain it. The tension between us had reached its peak, and I realized that I would not find rest unless I took action. And so, I did. The house remained quiet. As I stood outside Luke's bedroom door, my heart raced within my chest. I was uncertain of my intentions or what I would say, yet the stillness of the night seemed to draw me toward him. The faint light emanating from beneath his door indicated that he was still awake, and before I could second-guess myself, I knocked gently. "Yeah?" His voice came through the door, muffled yet distinctly his. "It's me," I replied softly. "Can I come in?" There was a brief pause before the door creaked open. Luke stood before me, our eyes locking, his expression a blend of surprise and something I could not quite identify. "Hey," he said, stepping aside to allow me entry. "Hey," I responded, my voice quieter than usual as I entered the room. The warm glow from the bedside lamp enveloped the space, creating an intimate atmosphere. Luke closed the door behind me and leaned against it, his gaze searching mine. "I couldn't sleep," I confessed, crossing my arms over my chest. "I thought maybe we could talk." He nodded, gesturing toward the bed. "Yeah, of course." I settled onto the edge of the bed, the mattress sinking slightly under my weight. Luke joined me, the closeness igniting a warmth within me. For a moment, we remained silent, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. "You've been quiet all evening," I finally said, turning to face him. "Is everything okay?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair before meeting my gaze. "I don't know. Being here with you feels different now. I can't quite explain it." His words caught in my throat, and my heart began to race. "Different how?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His gaze fell to his hands before returning to mine. "It's like I'm seeing you in a way I haven't before, and I don't want to mess this up." I swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. "You're not going to mess anything up, Luke," I said softly. "You're important to me more than I think I realized." His eyes searched mine, and the intensity of his gaze made my chest tighten. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand over his. Luke's presence ignited a spark between us. He shifted slightly, leaning in closer, his breath grazing my cheek. "Joe," he murmured, his voice low and uncertain. I chose not to respond verbally. Instead, I closed the gap between us, my lips brushing against his in a tentative kiss. The instant our lips met, it felt as though the world around us vanished. His hand cupped my face, his touch both gentle and firm, and I surrendered to him. The kiss deepened, a slow and unspoken acknowledgement of the feelings we had both harbored but had not articulated. His other hand found its place on my waist, drawing me nearer as my fingers tangled in his hair. Every part of me felt invigorated, as if I had been holding my breath for weeks and could finally exhale. We ventured further, and I believe you can guess what transpired that night. I think we shared that intimacy 4 or 5 times. It was extraordinary. When we finally separated, our foreheads rested against one another, our breaths mingling in the stillness of the room. Luke's gaze searched mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw all the fears I had been reluctant to acknowledge reflected back at me. "Joe," he whispered, his voice trembling, "this feels right, doesn't it?" I nodded, unable to articulate the torrent of emotions surging within me. Instead, I leaned in once more, pressing a gentle kiss to his lips, allowing my actions to convey my feelings. Whatever this was, whatever path we were embarking upon, it belonged to us. The following morning, the atmosphere in the house was charged with a quiet tension that, while not uncomfortable, was undeniably different. I awoke early, sunlight streaming through the blinds, and found myself staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and anticipation. The memory of Luke's words and the vulnerability in his voice lingered in my mind, refusing to dissipate. I dressed quickly, opting for a light sweater and jeans, and made my way to the kitchen. The familiar clatter of coffee cups grounded me in my routine. Luke was already there, leaning against the counter with a mug in hand, his expression contemplative. "Morning," I said softly, my voice breaking the stillness. He looked up, a hint of surprise in his eyes. A faint smile played at the edges of his lips as we shared a moment of silence in the morning, neither of us speaking. The quiet was filled with unexpressed thoughts. Eventually, I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter across from him, the warmth of the ceramic grounding me as I sought the right words. "Did you sleep well, honey?" I inquired, my tone casual yet laced with uncertainty. He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the swirling coffee in his cup. "Not really, too much on my mind." I nodded, fully understanding. "Me too." The words lingered in the air, and I sensed his eyes on me, searching for something I was unsure I could provide. Finally, he set his mug down and crossed his arms, his expression turning serious. "Joe," he began, his voice calm yet gentle, "about last night." I gently interrupted, meeting his gaze. "We need to talk." He nodded, his expression a mix of tension and hope. "I just need to know where we stand. I don't want to complicate things for either of us, but I can't ignore this." Taking a deep breath, I placed my mug down, searching for the right words. "Luke, this is new for both of us. It's confusing and complicated, but we can't let it spiral out of control." "I don't want to make things worse," he said quickly, his voice earnest. "But I also don't want to pretend this isn't happening." "Neither do I admitted, my tone soft yet resolute. "But we must be cautious, take things slowly, and be honest with each other." He nodded, his hazel eyes steady and filled with determination. "I can do that. I just want to figure this out with you." His words sent a shiver through me, tightening my chest with a blend of fear and longing. The path ahead was uncertain, yet the sincerity in his voice instilled hope that we could navigate it together. "We will," I replied softly, my voice steady despite the tumult of emotions within me. "But it's going to take time." Luke offered a small, genuine smile that made my heart ache. "Time I can handle." For the remainder of the morning, we moved through the house with a renewed sense of understanding, the tension between us beginning to shift. In a more subdued yet equally impactful manner, we chose not to revisit the events of the previous night, yet their presence lingered in every glance, every shared smile, and every unspoken sentiment. By afternoon, the sun had infused warmth into the house, and I found myself in the living room, sifting through old photo albums. Luke entered, his curiosity piqued as he settled beside me on the couch. "What are you looking at?" he inquired, leaning in to catch a glimpse of the images. "Just some old memories," I responded, turning the page to reveal a photograph of my family at the beach. "These were simpler times," I remarked. He smiled, his expression gentle as he examined the picture. "You look happy." I confessed, my voice tinged with nostalgia. "But life changes, doesn't it?" He nodded, his gaze lingering on the photograph before meeting mine. "It does, but that doesn't mean we can't find happiness again." His words resonated deeply within me, igniting a warmth in my chest. There was something about Luke's presence, his quiet assurance and steadfast sincerity, that instilled a sense of belief in me. As the afternoon transitioned into evening, our conversation flowed effortlessly. We shared laughter over familiar stories, reminisced about simpler times, and gradually began to strengthen the bond that had always existed between us, now more resilient than ever. As the sun set below the horizon, casting a warm golden light throughout the room, I became aware of how much lighter I felt. The burdens of uncertainty and fear had dissipated, replaced by a quiet hope that together we could confront whatever lay ahead. When Luke stood to leave, his hand brushed against mine, the touch lingering just long enough to send a shiver down my spine. He glanced back at me, his hazel eyes reflecting an emotion I could not quite identify, and smiled. "Good night, Joe," he said softly, his voice steady yet warm. "Good night, Luke," I replied, watching him disappear down the hallway. Alone in the tranquil living room, my thoughts wandered back to the day's events. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time, I felt a sense of clarity. Challenges lie ahead, and I was aware that we would confront them together, one step at a time. However, the day of Luke's departure arrived more swiftly than I had anticipated. The tension in the atmosphere had served as a constant reminder, and that morning, the house felt unusually quiet, as if it sensed the impending absence of his presence. I found myself in the kitchen, gazing at the coffee pot as it brewed, attempting to suppress the ache in my chest. Luke appeared in the doorway, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His expression was calm, yet his eyes revealed the same blend of emotions that I was experiencing. "Morning," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. "Coffee?" He nodded, placing his bag down by the door and taking a seat at the table. I poured 2 mugs, setting one in front of him before sitting across from him. The silence that enveloped us was heavy, yet not uncomfortable, as if we were both preparing for what lay ahead. I wrapped my hands around the mug. "Everything packed?" I inquired. "Yeah," he replied, nodding. "I triple-checked this morning. Don't want to forget anything." I chuckled softly, though the sound felt hollow. "That's a first. You used to forget half your things every time you left somewhere." He smiled, the warmth of his expression both comforting and bittersweet. "Guess I'm finally growing up." For a brief moment, we both laughed, the sound filling the space between us. However, as the laughter faded, the weight of his impending departure settled over us once again. "Joe," he said after a long pause, his voice steady yet hesitant, "I just want to say thank you for everything." "You don't have to thank me," I replied, my voice soft but resolute. "You've been here for me just as much as I've been here for you." He nodded, his gaze dropping to his mug. "Still, I don't know what I would have done without you." "You don't have to do it alone," I said, my words carrying more significance than I had intended. "You know that, right? Wherever you go, whatever happens, I'm here." His eyes met mine, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw them glisten. "I know," he said quietly. "That means more than you'll ever know." The clock. The hour had arrived, and we both understood it was time to part ways. Luke stood up, grabbing his bag and slinging it over his shoulder. I followed him to the door, my heart racing with each step. As he turned to face me, the sunlight streaming through the window illuminated his features, making his hazel eyes appear even more vibrant. He hesitated, his gaze searching for mine. "I will return," he finally said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "I know," I replied, my voice trembling despite my efforts to remain composed. "Take care of yourself, okay?" "You too," he responded softly. Before I could gather my thoughts, he pulled me into a tight embrace, his arms enveloping me completely. I felt the warmth of his presence seep into every part of me, and I closed my eyes, cherishing the moment, aware that it would be our last for some time. When he finally released me, his hand lingered on my arm for a brief moment before he stepped back, his expression a mix of sadness and determination. He picked up his bag, opened the door, and walked out, the sound of his footsteps gradually fading into the distance. I stood in the doorway, watching him disappear down the street, the ache in my chest intensifying with each step he took. Yet, even as tears threatened to spill, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. Luke was not gone forever, and deep down, I knew this was not the conclusion of our story. As I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, I exhaled a shaky breath. The house felt emptier without him, yet it was also filled with the echoes of our shared moments, the laughter, the quiet times, and everything in between. In that stillness, I came to an important realization: although Luke had left, the bond we had forged would remain unbreakable, regardless of the distance between us. To this day, I find myself uncertain about my feelings. I question whether I am in love or if my emotions stem from other reasons. I seek someone's perspective on this matter, which is why I chose to share my story with you. What are your thoughts? Please let me know in the comments. Thank you.